My topic is responses to extremism in democratic societies, specifically through the lens of the Rabin assassination. Of course, as we've been talking about all day, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin reverberated through Israel and throughout the world for many, many reasons, many of which have already been talked about today. I'm going to focus on just one of them. I'm a constitutional theorist by training, and what I try to see is the kinds of similar responses that societies have based on the way that they're structured, so on their constitutional structure. I try to see, is there something distinctive about the way that societies are structured so that they respond in a certain way? So extremism, and of course assassination is the ultimate form of that, is a particularly interesting case in point. So how do societies react when you have that moment where the leader is assassinated? I limit the study of this to democratic societies because trying to compare authoritarian societies to democratic societies in this front is not useful. So I limit it to the democratic front. Professor Friedman is a real political scientist. I moved my way into the legal world, although I think you went to Penn undergrad, correct? I went there for my doctorate. We have to talk about some of the professors who I'm sure we shared. One of the things that I was sort of tasked to do at Penn when I was getting my doctorate was, could I come up, and this was the metaphor that was used, with the equivalent of a political blood pressure. So one of the things that we look at with a human being is there are lots of things a doctor can tell you about whether you're healthy or not. The most common one we all know about is blood pressure. So what's a societal blood pressure? And what I came up with in some of the work I was doing then was that this blood pressure moment is the response to extremism. So in response to extremism, you can either see, and I'm going to kill the metaphor here for a minute, high blood pressure, where the potential is for a heart attack, and again, I'll keep killing this metaphor for another 30 seconds, or ridiculously low blood pressure, where you risk heart failure and your energy levels drop. So how a democratic society, I posited, responds to moments of extremism is, I'll argue for the next 24 minutes, that sort of telltale measurement of the health of a society. So here's the basic framework that I've worked with before. And again, I'll use another metaphor. Societies are like people. So I walk around this campus a lot. Those of you who have spent a lot of time on this campus, let's say you're crossing Amsterdam and running, as I often do, to catch the A train to go down to Stern or something along those lines. And a taxi cab comes from Amsterdam and comes through the crosswalk and almost hits you. So the first thing that happens is your emotions take over in that first moment. You feel your heart rate race to the top of the possible charts. You get angry, maybe you say certain words that you shouldn't say in mixed company, certainly not in front of a camera, and that's the first 30 seconds or so of your time. And then, well, maybe hopefully only 5 or 6 seconds of your time. And then what happens is your emotions move to one side and reason starts to take over. The structure that you have inside of you starts to take over. I use the same metaphor for societies as well. So in that first moment after extremism in a society, what you have is panic. What you have is the racing of emotions in your heart. And then what happens afterwards is you have the structure of the society, the constitution of the society sort of kicks back in as the thing that will bring you back to stasis. I look for those patterns. The phrase that my father gave me as I was writing up my dissertation is choreography, that there's a dance that happens between the different parts of society. My job is to figure out the way that dance is balanced. And I'll get to Israel in a minute. I'm going to talk about the assassinations that we've had a chance to study more. Yitzhak Rabin was killed 20 years ago. You'd think you'd have enough time. I'm a constitutional theorist. My timeline is centuries. So I'll go back to the beginning of the previous century. And first, let's step back. 4 of the 44 presidents in United States history have been assassinated. So that's 10% of the people who held the office. Perhaps not a huge surprise in a society awash with guns, but still, 10% of our presidents have been killed. After each of these traumatic moments in American history, political scientists have looked back. The one we know are most familiar with now maybe is Lincoln, maybe Kennedy. But there have been real shocks to the system. The question is, what happens after that shock passes and what society does? So Lincoln and Kennedy are the two presidents we know who were assassinated. If I quiz the room, most of everyone would have known that. The others who have been assassinated in American history, I'm not going to have you pull out your phones and do like an online quiz. Some of you will know this. McKinley, there was another one. Garfield, right? So two we hear very few about. I'm going to actually see if I can draw a lesson from the assassination of William McKinley, which I take to be almost impossible, but I'll see if I can get it done. So McKinley was killed in 1901, actually here in New York State, in Buffalo. He was killed by an anarchist, whose name I will not mangle, but someone can look it up and maybe pronounce it better than I can. Anarchism was on the rise at that point in the United States. Just the previous year, leader of Italy had been assassinated as well. McKinley is murdered, is assassinated, and then Teddy Roosevelt becomes president in his place, his vice president. Here's the quote that he gave when he first took office. When compared with the suppression of anarchy, every other question sinks into significance. This is his quote. So the sharp emotional response that resulted from the assassination of William McKinley was a statute that was passed in many states, including New York, where it was very palpable what had happened. This was a criminal anarchy statute. So what it made was not only the activity of criminal anarchy a crime, but it made the encouragement of criminal anarchy a crime. This, you can tell, was probably in some opposition to things like the First Amendment. We'll get back to that in a second. So fast forward about 10 or 15 years, and the United States enters World War I. Again, an extremist situation. Let's see how American society responds, and then we'll get back to Israel in a moment. So one of the laws that was passed soon after the United States entered World War I was called the Sedition Act of 1918. Again, not an act that people know much about. In fact, it's still, to some degree, still on the books. What the Sedition Act made, and this is going to offend even more of you who care about the First Amendment, it made it a federal crime, and I'll quote from the description of it, to use any form of speech or print that would cast the government or the war effort in a negative light, or even that interfered with the sale of government bonds, just to make it even more extreme. Again, in clear tension with the First Amendment. So the question, to look back at the way societies respond to extremism, why do we let these things happen? Why do we allow society to sort of go off the rails in response to extremism? And I'll come back to that question in a second. So soon after the passage of the Sedition Act and something else called the Espionage Act of 1917, there was a man named Benjamin Gitlow. Anyone remember Benjamin Gitlow? A few of you, maybe not. So Ben Gitlow was the New York State Assemblyman for the Bronx, in fact, not far from here. He wrote something called, and he called it this on purpose, the Left-Wing Manifesto. You only use the word manifesto if you're really trying to get people upset in 1919 and 1920. That's not really a time you want to be using that word unless you're really trying to get everyone's attention. It simply lauded, I'm overstating it, the benefits of socialism over capitalism. But his ultimate purpose was to get people to not participate in the draft for World War I. Right? So as a socialist, as a committed socialist, and later as a communist, Ben Gitlow, his goal was to get people not to participate in World War I, and clearly not to give money for government bonds. So this puts him in a tough situation relative to the sedition law. He was convicted under these laws, and not slapped on the wrist. He was sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison, and not in some cushy prison, but in Sing Sing. So he went up the river, literally. He spent 2 years doing basically hard labor in Sing Sing, and he was paroled. In the process, he became quite famous. He was the vice presidential candidate for the Socialist Workers' Party of America in 1924, just after he was let out of prison. He appealed his conviction, and the case finally came to the United States Supreme Court some years later. And here's where I believe we can draw broader lessons for how democratic societies like the United States and Israel respond to assassination, the ultimate in extremism. So he was represented in the Supreme Court by a very new organization that had just come onto the playing field of civil rights, called the American Civil Liberties Union. In fact, the very first case that the ACLU ever brought to the United States Supreme Court was Ben Gitlow's case. It was founded in part, as many of you in this room probably know better than I do, by people like Felix Frankfurter. So Gitlow's ACLU lawyers fought the very good fight on how the First Amendment should win over a simple statute and how we have to stick to our principles despite things like extremism. But he lost. So Gitlow, who had been paroled, run for vice president, lost in the Supreme Court, and then was told to report back to Sing Sing right after the Supreme Court decided. So this sounds depressing, right? So it sounds like the First Amendment lost. It sounds like extremism won in response to this. But let's take a step back and look at, again, what I'm calling the choreography of this. So I think I think the choreography of this is an object lesson for how the people in this room, who I think are here in part because they have aspirations for the peace that can take place in Israel, at least I hope, and look back at object lessons from our experience in the United States, again, 110 years past this assassination, and see where things go. So his return to prison was very short-lived, Ben Gitlow, right? He was almost immediately pardoned by the governor of New York, who realized he had a sensational political prisoner on his hand and didn't agree with the Sedition Act here. So he has a joyful return from Sing Sing back to Grand Central. I didn't even know there was a train from Sing Sing to Grand Central. It's good to know. I'll put that in my mind for the future. So he was soon again a candidate for the governor of New York under the Socialist Workers' Parties. He did not win, sadly. And he was again the candidate for vice president of the United States for the Socialist Workers' Party of the United States. So he didn't lose personally. So again, him personally, he didn't pay too much of a price afterwards. He has an interesting life afterwards. He becomes fairly radicalized. He becomes a leader in the Communist Party, eventually becomes a Republican, and goes back all the way the other way. So there might have been a little instability in this man. We'll have to look more carefully at that at a different time. But more broadly, beyond Ben Gitlow himself, there was an ultimate victory, I think, for balance and moderation that we can see in the United States that I hope we can also see in Israel. His conviction was upheld by the Supreme Court, but there's a big but there. In the majority opinion and in the very famous dissent written by Oliver Wendell Holmes, co-signed by Louis Brandeis, and I see Dr. Schatz thinking about, do you know this case well? Should we? I expect some hard questions coming up after this. So what they found in this defeat for free speech was the ultimate victory for restoring balance in society. So very early in American history, it had been determined that the Bill of Rights, when we think of the First Amendment, we think of the Bill of Rights and those sorts of things, only applied to the federal government and not the states. So in the moment of Gitlow, even though Gitlow lost, what we found in this particular case was the moment where the Supreme Court decided that the Constitution, that the Bill of Rights, these protections also applied to the states. It was a 40-year battle to get to that. So from the mid-1920s to the mid-1960s, it took 2 generations to get to that point where we could see those rights that couldn't be violated by the federal government also then applied to the states. It's a process called incorporation. Gitlow is that pivot moment. So in that loss of Ben Gitlow going back to prison and in free speech appearing to lose at this particular point, it was the moment that the Supreme Court decided, again, not in your face, but incrementally, that it was going to begin to move towards a society where civil rights were protected, not just against the federal government, but also against the states. Again, it took through the 1960s to the cases you probably know better, cases like Miranda and other cases where civil rights were applied against the states into the 1960s. Again, it took a full 40 years, but we'll talk about how we can maybe draw some lessons from Israel about that in a moment. So one of the things that's asked a lot about the study of constitutions more broadly is why they work. So what in particular allows a constitution to function? People have spent a great deal of time trying to figure out why America has succeeded at the level that it has. Lots of people have written about this. I think America probably would have succeeded with any constitution. You have pretty much an empty country, no offense to Native Americans, but compared to us militarily, they didn't have much of a chance. We probably would have won no matter what constitution we had. Israel is a harder case. Israel is a democratic society, as many of the previous speakers have talked about, that is basically in a constant state of war. They have daily existential threats, at least in my view. But its system of government, while absolutely, utterly contentious, always finds a way to rebalance. So I'll talk a little bit more detail now. I'll switch back to Israel. So in the aftermath of the assassination of Rabin, as has been discussed already, Shimon Peres took over as interim prime minister. So as was talked about, he decided to call not for snap elections, but for early elections, basically because he wanted to find out what the public's attitude was for the Oslo Peace Accords. This was also, and this is where I'll ask my actual political science friend in the room to follow up later, this was also, as I recall, the first direct election of the prime minister's position in Israel, right? To this point, the prime minister was elected as the head of the slate, but not directly. So you have this interesting confluence when it comes to the choreography of Israeli politics. You have, on the one hand, the assassination of a prime minister who's going in a very distinct direction. And then you have his replacement trying to find out in a parliamentary system whether he has the support of the people. But at the same time, you have this interesting confluence of a direct election of a prime minister. So it's not just the slate, it's not just the party, but for the first time you have sort of an American flavor of the leader of the party being directly elected. So again, it gets extremely complicated to try to pull apart that choreography. So there was that part of it. So there's a question not just of whether you support Labor Likud, it was whether you support Peres versus Netanyahu. It's not just the party and the ideals, it's it's the personality much more than it was in the past. You also have in the context of this, where there was this potential moment where Peres would have been elected, and the election was extremely close. You have an uptick, a radical uptick in violence in Israel, where some of the most horrific attacks on civilians take place. You have, in 1 week, 100 Israelis killed in a series of separate attacks where entire busloads of people are massacred. You have the Israeli public trying to figure out which of these leaders, not just which of these parties, but which of these leaders is going to keep me more safe. And of course, Netanyahu wins. And again, it appeared, I think, for the peaceniks in Israel, that extremists had won, that the assassin had won. And there's certainly some degree of truth to that view. But let me step back again to the American perspective. So again, we're 20 years past, and I was a much younger person when Rabin was assassinated. But it's a blink of the eye, even for a country like Israel in terms of time. I think whether I can point to a particular moment or trend in Israeli society where it does appear as if the ideals of Rabin are being put forward, I don't think I can put a finger on it. We could talk about huge protests that have taken place over the last few years from the left. The other true complexity in studying Israeli society, and there are people in the room who know it far better than I do, is the ultimately fractious politics that takes place in Israel. In the United States, we have two parties. Studying the choreography of two parties and three branches is a piece of cake compared to studying the choreography of Israel, which might have been the reason why I walked away from studying Israeli politics too closely. I'm a fan of traditional dance, and Israeli society is obviously modern dance, which I've never really been a fan of, so it's hard for me to figure it quite out. But to look back again at the comparative moment, what you see a loss, I think, in front of you with someone like Gitlow, and you see him going up the river to Sing Sing. You see free speech being beaten down. But what you saw in that moment ultimately was not only the incorporation of the Bill of Rights against the states to protect all of our rights, not only against the federal government, but against all the states, but you also see the spawning of something like the ACLU. You see from that moment, and if you go to the ACLU website right now, and the first case they talk about is Gitlow. It was the beginning of this. The ACLU was created to counter the kinds of things that were happening, the extremist things that were happening in American society. A lot of the centers, including the Rabin Center, as we heard from his daughter, were created for the same purpose. And the role that they're playing is incremental, and it hasn't happened quite yet, but it's on its way to getting there, I think most people thoroughly believe. We're only one generation, so 20 years past the assassination of Rabin. And Israeli society responded with a kind of gut reaction I was talking about that you have when you cross the street and a guy in a black Camry tries to run you over. Not that I've had this experience many times. And there was a swing to this other path, this radical other path. And then another swing back to the path Rabin had set with Ehud Barak. What I see as the choreographer, or at least someone studying the choreography of these societies, is that the structural pieces are in place. And I was very heartened to hear Rabin's daughter talk about the role that the Rabin Center is playing. The short-lived move to direct elections, as Professor Friedman can confirm, was pushed aside. It led to an extraordinary electoral schizophrenia, where you had a prime minister overseeing a government that wasn't part of his party. We went through the same thing early on in the United States, where our Constitution, written in haste in a very sweaty summer in Philadelphia in 1787, where they didn't quite come up with the way that this was supposed to work. It got messed up. We amended the Constitution. We still didn't get it right. 200 years later, we sort of have it down, although those people who see the constant internecine battles between Republicans and Democrats might disagree. So that experiment left, so it's a little bit easier to study society, but not that much easier to study Israeli society. So I'm tempted to end, but I'll finish up a few more things just about Israel. As many of you know, and have been thinking in the audience, the applicability of the American model to Israel is probably something that I'm imposing as an American. It might not be real. I think that you can look at societies and sort of do experiments on them mentally, but maybe some people don't agree with me, and I grant that as well. To try to figure out how America responded to the Red Scare, where there was this sense that there were Reds under the bed. I have a pamphlet in my office given to me by one of my radical left professors at Yale called "The Red Hand in the Professor's Glove," about how communists were taking over on campus as well. That wasn't fundamentally true, right? There weren't Reds under the bed, and there were some lefty professors in the United States, but they weren't necessarily taking over the United States. Israel is a state that is constantly, there is always a Red under the bed, but it's not a Red. In this case, it's a terrorist. This is part of the reality of living in Israel, especially the past month and a half. How serious it is, and we'll talk, Roy Carmine, I don't mean to over put too much importance on how, whether it's really an existential threat to Israeli society or not. I know you talked about that. But we here became very fearful, but in reality, the threat that Israel faces is much more extreme. It might not be existential, but it's much more extreme. And there are many complications to the comparison. So for instance, as I said, the parliamentary system is much more complicated. There's no written constitution in Israel, which also makes things very difficult to try to figure out exactly how that choreography is going to work. I was part of an abortive effort about 15 years ago to move towards writing a constitution for Israel, which obviously is going to be ultimately impossible given how fractious the society is, but it was a thought. And then the other part is that while we did think the communists were out to get us, there are elements on the Palestinian side that have, their business model is basically based on the continued state of war between Israel and the Palestinians. In the form of these random stabbings that we're dealing with now, there's been no line drawn between combatants and soldiers. So again, true extremism that maybe can't be balanced with the American model at all. I also want to talk just about contemporary issues. There's now a law that a number of people I think in this room have talked to me about, which says that if you support the BDS movement, the boycott movement in Israel, it's a crime in Israel to support that. So if you're a member, an Israeli academic, or anyone in Israeli society, and you appear to support BDS, it is a crime and can be punished as such in Israel. From the left, that's absurd. It's a violation of this free speech, the basis of free speech. From an Israeli perspective, BDS is existential. That if the international trade that Israel depends on is ended, then Israel itself will be much weakened. But there are real questions about whether that can stand up to democratic scrutiny. Maybe it'll end up in the same place as the Espionage Act and the Criminal Anarchy Act. But I read an interview with a professor from Israel who was being interviewed by The Forward, and his response was, "Do you think I want to go to prison for 5 years for an interview with The Forward?" Which I thought was funny, but maybe for the Jewish Times, maybe for the Jerusalem Post it's worth, but not, no, I think that's what he was implying, but that's probably just me, not a huge fan of The Forward at the moment. But when I was asked about this particular law, what I came back to in my mind was President Lincoln. So at the end of, at the beginning of the Civil War, he suspended habeas corpus, as many of you know. So a fundamental right in the Constitution was suspended because Lincoln believed that the society itself was its history, its survival was in question. So there are some comparisons, but maybe not particularly perfect ones. The other thing I want to talk about, and again, I didn't want to be the first one to mention Meir Kahane today, because I know that's still a complicated subject here at YU especially. I watched with special interest that Mayor Edinger, right, his grandson, was put in detention as a result of this. Israel recognizes, I believe, that extreme actions on both sides, both on the Israeli and the Palestinian side, have to be controlled in some way. This is, I think, the Israeli way of trying to deal with extremism on these levels. He was not thrown in jail for 5 to 10 years. He was put in detention. I believe he's out now, right? I think he was only in for about a month. I think what I take in terms of a broader sense of hope about this, and now I'll conclude, and I do want to just mention Meir Kahane before I do, right? So his party was actually banned, right? Because his views were seen as inimical to Israeli democracy and maybe to democracy as a whole. Alan Dershowitz is not here. He was a staunch defender of Kahane's right to have a party, even though it was racist, I think, by any stretch of the imagination. Israel has found ways within its democratic structure to restrict things like speech and even political activity. So to conclude, I do want you to come away from what I've said before, from my perspective as an Americanist who has written about the dangers of the radical right in Israel, that I think there's some hope that 20 years in, it's not clear exactly how strong that hope is. But I think that hope for our people is always about the future, right? As one of the morning speakers said, I think part of being, I know it's probably Professor Friedman, part of being Jewish is being hopeful. Also a little depressed, probably as well. So maybe I'm a little of both. I think democratic societies like the United States and like Israel have within the principle to find balance again. We often respond in the heat of the moment with things like throwing Ben Gitlow in prison for years, or with the election of the extreme opposite of someone who seemed to be so close to achieving peace. But then the society balances itself again. And once we find a way to balance that multiplicity of impulses, I think in the end, we do have a hopeful situation. Thank you.